Hello and welcome to the CNBC TV 18 special. I'm Shireen Bhan, and on this edition of Going for Growth, we're in conversation with the CEO of Niti Aayog on a bunch of issues that Niti is currently working on. Joining us now is Mr. Amitabh Kant. Mr. Kant, many thanks for joining us on CNBC TV 18, and let me start by wishing you a very happy New Year, sir. I want to first focus on what is going on.
To all your viewers.
Appreciate that. I want to first start, sir, with what's going on as far as the railways are concerned. We've seen the cabinet take the decision to restructure the railway board. You were heading the committee that was looking at privatization of select stations, as well as the ability to bring in private operators to run select trains. Can you give us a status check of where things currently stand there?
So, Shireen, we've had a series of meetings. This committee comprising of Chairman Railway Board, Secretary Economic Affairs, all the members and Secretary Urban Development. We've had a series of meetings, and I wanted to tell you that we've finalized entire process of bringing in private sector participants in the operation of about 150 trains.
Okay.
So the routes, the train sets, all have been identified, and the concession agreements have all been structured. The projects were finalized, and then they went to the PPAC committee, which approved it, and then it has. We've had a stakeholder consultation, and there was a very, very good response. And let me tell you, this is one of India's most unique opportunities of bringing in private sector players into train operation.
Okay.
And a lot of homework has been done around this so that it's a win-win situation. And if the next step would be to roll out the RFP, RFQ, which should be done within the next 10 days. And similarly, we've undertaken very, very detailed exercise of undertaking the work for railway stations. And in the first lot, we've looked at about close to 10 railway stations on which a lot of homework had already been done. And we've moved ahead. The RFP, RFQ notice for the first lot of 5 stations has already been issued. And we'll move ahead with another 5. And I'm quite hopeful that soon you will have 10 railway stations for which private sector will be bidding for. And again, there were a lot of very complex issues relating to this, so that it could be a very transparent, competitive exercise, and we could attract some of the best players from around the world.
Okay.
This exercise has been undertaken, and we've consulted the state governments as well. And the RFP for the first lot has been issued already. So a lot of movement forward on the railways, not merely the restructuring of the railway board, which the government has announced, and I think it's very radical in its nature, but it's also very progressive. And I think what the country was looking forward is bringing in greater efficiency through private sector participation in operation of train sets, which is being done for the first time in the country,
right,
as well as moving forward on the privatization of 10 railway stations.
Okay, let me break up each of those, and thanks for giving us some color on where both these proposals currently stand. And I'll start by talking about bringing the private sector into operating trains. You said 150 routes will be given out, and that you have finalized the entire process. If you can give us some details of what these concession agreements are going to look like, when do you expect the bidding process to start? You said that the RFP and the RFQ should be out in the next few days. And also, what will the commercial arrangement be with the Indian Railways once these private sector operators come on board?
So, Sharon, one of the key challenges in railways always has been that when you try and bring in private sector players, the haulage rates are very high. And that makes the project commercially non-viable for the private sector. And for the first time, what we've done is that we've tried to bring down the haulage rate without loading all the other inefficiencies.
Okay.
So that we bring in we are able to ensure a win-win situation which takes care of the interests of the government as well as the private sector. So we've done a lot of exercise taking all the members of the railway board on this. We've also done this very detailed exercise of identifying the routes. We've also done a very detailed exercise of doing a long-term concession agreement so that the details of which will be soon made available when the RFP, RFQ is brought out. I don't want to preempt that, but you will see a very good and a very fine concession agreement which will ensure that there's a huge amount of private sector interest in this. And we are taking the feedback of the private sector into this.
You talked about one specific aspect, which is the haulage rates that you've tried to bring down so as to make this much more attractive for the private sector. Can you take us through some of the other feedback that you got from stakeholders, which you've been able to rectify or will rectify in the concession agreement so as to incentivize them to come on board? And some color on the likely routes. And what is the rationale for the routes that have been selected to be put up for privatization? And when you talk about stakeholders, are we talking only about Indian private companies, or are we also talking about foreign entities who are looking at some of these routes?
So, Shireen, there were a lot of, quite a few foreign companies as well which had participated in this. Who bids for it finally is a function of how attractive is the bid. And that's why in the first lot we've largely gone through the metro routes. Delhi Mumbai, for instance, or Delhi Calcutta, for instance, and looked at metro routes so that we make the proposal fairly attractive for the bidders. Now, one of the, haulage rate, bringing it to the right rates, because eventually in government we have a lot of other expenditure. If we load on all that variable cost onto the haulage charge, it's a non-doable proposition. So we had a tough job to bring ourselves to the conviction that we need to do it to the right haulage charge, which has now been agreed upon. We have also looked at a fairly long concession period, so that the people who are bidding for it actually generate good resources and good revenue. And thirdly, our interest isn't to bring in very strong private players. Our objective is that we should be able to get the best private players from across the world, not merely India, but across the world. And therefore, that's the way the deal has been structured, so that we should be able to generate competition, we should be able to have more than one player on the same route over a period of time, not immediately, but over a period of time. And they should be able to compete with the Indian Railways as well. And I'm, to my mind, this is a very major breakthrough. This is revolutionary in many ways to bring in efficiency into the Indian Railway system.
Can you again give us more details, sir, on what the concession agreement timeline will be? And also, from an operational perspective, what do you believe could be the challenges that you will need to deal with when it comes to integration? Because these are going to be 150 routes that you are going to hand out to the private sector. So what about the operational integration? And post the bidding process, when do you expect the first route to take off, so to speak?
I would, the key to my mind is to give complete operational freedom to the private player. How he runs the train, what he provides internally, the quality of services that he provides, the extent of hospitality that he provides, how he brands, how he positions his product, how he markets it, is all a function of the private player. The only resource that he uses of the railways is really the infrastructure on which he operates the train. Rest is a quality of the service that he uses. He uses the track and uses the signaling system of the railways. And that the concession agreement takes care of, that complete 100% operational freedom is provided. The risk allocation is in such a manner that the risks as far as the track and the signaling system is vested in the railways. The rest of the private sector and the market risks is all taken by the private sector.
Okay, so you're saying complete operational freedom will be given to the private sector, which would obviously mean pricing as well. But when do you expect the first private operated train to be on the track, sir?
I would say that since we need to go through a very transparent competitive process, we'll have to give adequate timeline. But I would suggest that you should have private players coming in about 6 to 7 months' time.
6 to 7 months' time. Would that be the same timeline that we're looking at in terms of privatization of railway stations also, sir? And, again, even when we talk about the privatization process for railway stations, in fact, you yourself have written to the Railway Ministry and to the Railway Board Chairman on the sort of tardy response that this very stated objective has met with previously. What gives you confidence that this time around it will take off?
So I think the important thing, Shireen, is that you need to structure the railway station bids in a very appropriate manner. And one of the key things which happens in the case of airports was that you had a user's fee and you had revenue stream coming in, which is not the case the case with railway stations. So you have to ensure that it becomes a commercially viable, doable proposition. The way it has been structured this time around, and a lot of homework has been done by both Railway Board, Niti Aayog, and the Department of Economic Affairs in the Ministry of Finance, is to ensure that it becomes a very doable and a viable proposition for the private sector to participate in. And when these bids, when you look at the RFP, RFQ, you will find that they are a very, very attractive proposition. They allow you 99 years of lease, and they give you a lot of freedom for commercial usage, as well as a little bit of, huge amount of play around improvement of the railway station, which would be the first priority, but subsequently a huge amount of play around commercial as well as a little bit of residential.
My final question on this before we take a very quick break, Mr. Kant, any caveats, any restrictions on foreign entities here, or is it the same for both domestic as well as foreign entities?
No, FDI in the railway sector was relaxed quite some time back, and foreign direct investment 100% is permitted in railway sector, both for railway stations as well as for operation of trains.
Okay, I'm going to take a break, sir, but we're back in a moment to continue this conversation. We're getting a lot of interesting details here from the CEO of the Niti Aayog on the government's ambitious plan to put private sector operated trains on tracks, according to Mr. Kant, in the next 6 to 7 months, as well as privatization of railway stations. Back in a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching our special program, Going for Growth, and we're still in conversation with the CEO of Niti Aayog, Amitabh Kant. He's just given us some interesting color on the plan as far as putting private sector trains on track, run by the private sector, and of course privatization plans for railway stations as well tend to go up in the first round. Mr. Kant, let's talk a little bit about the fare hike that we've seen coming in for the railways. And it's a very marginal hike, so to speak. But, if we look at the financial performance of the railways, the operating ratio continues to be very poor. In fact, the railways have incurred a loss of about 31,128 crores in 2017-18 on account of pricing of passenger fares, which were below the cost of operation. So this hike, which results in revenue gain of about between 2,300 to 2,500 crore rupees for the railways, it's not really going to make a significant difference. So what really is the thinking and the rationale here?
No, Shireen, I think it's important to understand that over a period of time, the freight fare had been increased, whereas the passenger fare had not been increased. And we'd done gross injustice to railways by not having a tariff regulator. Actually, this entire pricing system needs to be deregulated, and it needs to have an independent regulator. It needs to be taken out of administrative system of the railway. And therefore, this was much called for, otherwise the operating ratio of the railways had gone totally haywire. And I don't think we need to blame the railway officials for this. There was a need to push this. So this has been done after a very long period of time. And I think we should, it's important that people like you and me who travel on railways and many other middle class and upper middle class people who travel in railway pay the actual fare of their costs. So the railway fares are over subsidized in India.
So if you're saying railway fares are over subsidized,
and if you don't allow,
and that there should be a tariff revision and a tariff hike to prevent the situation that railways are currently faced with, which is operating losses that are mounting, then do you believe that there is a need to regularly revisit the fares and perhaps take appropriate action more frequently?
Yeah, as is done in the case of power, as is done in the case of water, as is done on every services. Why should railway be an exception? And there is a need for an independent regulator for this.
Okay.
And why should the richer class be subsidized? Nowhere in the world does this happen. Nowhere in the world does this happen.
Well,
I mean, why should you and I be subsidized?
Sure. Let me then ask you, Mr. Kant, but we're moving away from the railways to talk about other levers to try and ensure that we get growth back on the fast track. Now, I know that NITI has been pushing for several areas for more foreign direct investment. You've been responsible for liberalizing a lot of sectors where the cap has been opened up. Where do you believe that more can be done today? Which are the sectors that you believe warrant further liberalization?
Well, several sectors. There's need for structural reforms, and government has taken a series of measures. The Prime Minister had constituted a committee of chief ministers on agriculture. I think action will be taken on that. The Prime Minister had constituted two separate committees, one on mining and one on coal. The reports of that have just been finalized, so you will see greater liberalization probably with greater focus on production in both these areas. We need to do a lot more work around housing and real estate. And of course, the Prime Minister has already pushed for reforms in the labour sector, where instead of about 55 odd laws, we'll just have 4 codes. One has already been passed and 3 others have gone to the select committee. So you'll see major labour reforms. Now these are major, from a country viewpoint, these are major radical structural reforms in the Indian economy.
Specifically, sir, the budget had talked about looking at 3 sectors: insurance, aviation, insurance intermediaries. That has already happened. But do you believe that the time is right now to review the cap on insurance from the current to 74%? And do you believe that there will be many takers if the government were to do so?
Well, my belief is that at the present stage of our economy and the kind of liberalization that we've done, we need to receive far more greater level of foreign direct investment. And I think we need at least another 50 to 60 billion FDI of 50 to 60 billion dollars, and this is very much doable if we do greater levels of asset monetization. There's a massive potential. We construct roads. Government is extremely poor in operation and maintenance. Government makes airports. Government is extremely poor in operation and maintenance. We are, so these are all de-risk projects where revenue streams are coming in. We do a lot of transmission line. We do a lot of gas pipelines. All of them should be subjected to InvITs, REITs. We should subject them to a lot of to a lot of asset monetization.
Sure, I know that has
pension funds are waiting to.
You're saying pension funds are waiting to come in, sir. But, this asset monetization plan has been something that NITI has put forward several months ago. So are we any closer to any of these sectors that you spoke of, from the pipeline, transmission, infrastructure, etc., for action to start here, sir, in terms of asset monetization?
No, so 6 more airports will be put up for bidding for asset monetization. They've been already identified. You will have almost another 10,000 kilometers of highway roads, these are put out in blocks so as to ensure that there's adequate amount of private sector interest. 10,000 kilometers of roads will be put out, and you will have on InvITs some more transmission lines. 11 terminals and ports will be put out. This pipeline of projects for asset monetization has already been finalized.
Okay, you're saying that the asset monetization pipeline has also already been finalized. A broad timeline, sir, when we can expect, now that the terms may have been finalized, but the process from start to finish, what's the timeline that we're looking at?
I think next 3 to 6 months maximum.
Okay, 3 to 6 months is the timeline that you're
maximum.
looking. Yeah. I also want to talk about the state of the economy today, sir. And, we're awaiting a budget now, which we will see on the 1st of February. And again, hopes are building up around what the budget can deliver on to try and get the economy back on the high growth path. Now, to your mind and in your assessment, what seems to be the cause for the kind of collapse in credit growth that we are seeing, and what can be done then to spur that, to boost it?
So, Shireen, I think it's very important to my mind that the private debt to GDP ratio should rise. It's not the government expenditure is important, but government has FRBM limits, and government has to be disciplined about its expenditure, because it overcrowds. If it does more borrowing, it overcrowds the private sector, and private sector is then not able to borrow. And therefore, to my mind, the real potential for India's growth over the next 3 decades is about our private debt to GDP ratio is extremely low. And when countries like South Korea, Taiwan, China, Japan were growing, their private debt to GDP ratio was growing at very high rates. And my belief is that country needs to grow on the back of private sector. Private sector brings in efficiency over a period of time. And therefore, the massive potential for India is really on private debt to GDP ratio, and this would require our banking system and our NBFCs and our HFCs to fire on all engines.
Okay, but what will it take to get them to fire on all engines, sir? What do you believe the problem is today that is keeping private sector debt to GDP at the low rates that they are at, and what do you believe needs to be done? So as far as PSPs are concerned, one part of the recapitalization, I mean, that has been taken care of. Hopefully the NBFC problems are behind us, or at least the worst is behind us. HFCs again, I mean, what is it that you believe needs to be done at this point in time to get these engines to fire?
So, the finance minister has already acted on several measures, and in addition to that, one of the good things she's done is that she's called all the chief executives of public sector banks. She's reassured them. She's had a meeting with the investigating agencies to say that as long as things are done with integrity, they'll have to take risk and move forward. It's not possible that all the loans they give, none of them will have an NPA. It's part of the business to have some NPAs. And therefore, I think the bankers need to be given greater level of trust. We need to have greater faith in their integrity. And I think the banks themselves they need not refer so many cases to they should not refer so many cases to investigative agencies. If there is an administrative lapse, it should be subjected to an administrative inquiry. That's about all. Okay. But I think we need to bring the animal spirits in our banking system. So
are you then saying that there is currently...
And that is...
the paralysis perhaps or the fall in credit, the growth that we're seeing is partly on account of fear that has paralyzed the banking sector and lending operations?
No. So over a period of time, there are several things. One is, over a period of time, there was a cleaning up operation. But cleaning up has also led simultaneously to the creation of Jan Dhan accounts. It has led to the digitization, and therefore that is a massive potential for India, that it's possible for us now to have the credit history of people, and people should be able to get loans on the basis of credit history for housing, for cars. MSMEs should be able to get working capital on the basis of that, and this is really the big potential of growth. Households and MSMEs, and over a period of time, the lending for MSMEs and households should grow over a period of time.
Okay. Before I let you go, sir, finally, what do you believe need to be the priorities for the budget? I mean, various stakeholder meetings are underway, not just with the finance minister, but the prime minister is also meeting with industry and, of course, government officials. What do you believe the budget needs to prioritize? Part of the argument is that given where growth currently is today, it's okay to relax the fiscal targets a little bit and get the government to spend more to drive growth. What is it that you believe the government needs to prioritize?
So I'm a great believer in fiscal discipline, because if you become indisciplined, the cost of borrowing increases. But I'm a great believer that credit must flow. I'm a great believer that now that the government has cleaned up the act and brought in a massive amount of discipline, and government has digitized, and the government has opened bank accounts for such a vast majority of Indians, you should be able to lend based on sheer credit analysis. And the process of digitization should enable you to lend over a period of time. So credit, I think we need to revive the real estate sector, because that's a big creator of
But for real estate,
jobs.
sir, there's been several measures that the government has already announced for the real estate sector, including this fund that the finance minister announced several weeks ago. Do you believe that that is enough, or do you believe that more is warranted? And if more is warranted, then what more would you like to see?
So I think we should leave that to the finance minister to take a call on in the budget, rather than my prejudging the issue.
But what would you recommend?
But I personally feel that
has Niti recommended something?
No, what my recommendation, whatever Niti recommends is between us and the finance ministry. It should not be made public. But I'm a great believer that real estate is a big creator of jobs. It has a multiplier impact, and therefore we need to get that sector back, because actually many people don't realize this, but household investment in the real estate sector has collapsed by over 12,60,000 crores. So that's almost about a very substantial component of your GDP. And if we are able to get that sector back, then you are able to create a vast number of jobs. So that's critical. We need to get working capital back to MSMEs. And of course, we need a massive amount of structural reforms across other sectors of the economy, which the government has already done a lot of homework on.
Well, Mr. Kant,
so I'm very positive. I'm extremely optimistic.
Okay.
I'm extremely optimistic that India will get back to high trajectory growth.
All right, sir. We will see how these measures eventually pan out. And of course, we will wait to see what more the budget unveils. But many thanks, as always, for joining us on Going for Growth with your prescription for rebooting the railways, bringing the private sector in, and some of the other key recommendations that Niti has worked on. Thanks very much for your time.